Well, there you have it. Welcome to today's Ram Chat. I'm Joel Searby, the National Political Director for Renew America Movement, and very excited today to be joined by Judge Robert Orr. Judge Orr is a former Supreme Court justice in the state of North Carolina and a great friend to our movement. Great to have you today, Judge Orr.
Joel, thanks so much. It's a treat to be part of this program, and thanks so much to Renew America Movement for all the things that you've been doing to advance the cause of democracy and good government.
Well, we appreciate it, and we appreciate your partnership. So we're going to get right to it here shortly. We're going to talk about the Madison Cawthorn race. And I say the Madison Cawthorn race not because he owns that district, but because that's probably what most of you know as what's going on in that particular race in North Carolina. Judge Orr, unlike pretty much any human being I've ever seen, has followed this congressional race incredibly closely, has been intimately involved in conversations with a lot of different folks there, has a podcast about the race, which is actually incredibly well done. You should check it out, and we'll let him plug that in just a minute. But has been following it closely. There's been twists and turns and ins and outs and district lines and Cawthorn changing districts. All of that is important, and we're going to cover some of that in our conversation. But the news of the day that we want to talk about is there is a constitutional challenge to Cawthorn's candidacy, and Judge Orr is going to talk to us about that. And a number of North Carolina residents have raised that challenge. It's everywhere. If you've not seen it in the news, you can just type it into the old Google machine, and I promise you'll find a story about it. It's in a whole bunch of different outlets. There's already been opinion pieces written about it, and folks are taking this, seriously. But it's a really interesting approach. So we're going to talk about it today, and I want to start with that, Judge Orr. I just want to ask you if you could give us kind of the top line summary of what this challenge is about, who's involved, and then we'll have a little conversation about that, and of course we'll weave into that conversation about this race as a whole.
Sure, great. Look forward to it. The important thing to know is that this challenge is based on a state statute in North Carolina, which allows a voter to challenge the qualifications of any particular candidate for any office. And in this case, the challenge is unique in that it's based upon Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is, we know, was put in after the Civil War. And in a nutshell, it says that any individual who takes the oath of office to support the Constitution of the United States and then violates that oath by participating in a rebellion or an insurrection or giving aid and comfort or support to the people participating in that are prohibited from holding office, not only in the Congress of the United States, but in a wide range of other offices. And in this particular situation, Cawthorn, of course, took the oath of office after being elected to Congress and was immediately involved in what transpired in and around January 6th, including appearing at the rally on January 6th and commenting about all the fight in the people there. And so from our perspective, the three criteria, the three legal requirements under the 14th Amendment, Section 3, have been met. And so under the North Carolina statute, we have a group of voters, 11 individuals who are voters in what is now the 13th congressional district, who have filed affidavits saying they have reasonable suspicion to believe that he's violated the 14th Amendment, Section 3, and therefore is disqualified from holding office.
A great summary. Thank you, Judge. And I want to ask you about the specifics of why we think this is not only important, but how it might play out and why it might matter. I do want to say for all of our viewers, if you don't know, Renew America Movement has named Madison Cawthorn as one of our dividers. We have renewers who are members of Congress and senators whom we're supporting. And we have dividers whom we believe are tearing our democracy apart and have taken specific actions to do so and deserve to be unseated. And so, full disclosure, we are opposing Madison Cawthorn, and we certainly hope that this, along with perhaps many other means, will help to that end. But Judge Orr, talk to me about how a process like this might play out. The cynical political guy in me says, oh, here goes another political play. Of course, I'm supportive, and I don't think that's the case. But for those who may feel that way, why a legal challenge?
Well, first of all, this is a mandate under the United States Constitution. And we hear politicians, Cawthorn included, who consistently talk about, how important it is to support the Constitution and to follow the Constitution. And this isn't an optional provision. This is a mandatory provision under the Constitution. And it was put in there for a very specific reason. And that is that individuals who have taken that oath to support America and the Constitution that the country's founded on, and then breach that oath by supporting a rebellion or insurrection, should be and are prohibited from subsequently holding office. The unique part, of course, is that this is a provision of the Constitution that really hasn't been used since Reconstruction era. We have a leading case here in North Carolina that we can talk about whenever you want to dig in a little further into the weeds. But it is critical, I think, that this constitutional provision be enforced against Cawthorn or anyone else who violated their oath to support the Constitution by engaging in what we all saw on January 6th and the events that we've learned about surrounding and leading up to January 6th in an attempt to subvert that constitutional process for the peaceful transfer of power from the Trump administration to the newly elected President Joe Biden.
So let me ask you a follow-up. I'm no lawyer or legal scholar, but I think our viewers will be interested in understanding this. It seems to me that this word insurrection is an important one. I've read a number of opinion pieces and a few news articles about really the fight over even using that word. Of course, some Republicans are really trying to distance from that word. They don't want to see that word used. I would venture to guess that they're not quite sophisticated in the sense that they're thinking about these legal challenges, nor did they necessarily see this coming. However, in light of this legal challenge, it seems that that word and that phrase and how we define what really happened on January 6th is going to be really important to this case. So talk to me and our viewers a little bit about how important is that word and how it's defined, both relative to the case and the challenge, I should say, and just generally, in your opinion, as someone who's followed it and understands the law.
Well, it is certainly important in the legal context as to what exactly is an insurrection. The constitutional provision also includes the word rebellion. And I think in light of when the amendment was passed, we automatically start thinking about the Civil War and what happened there. But from a constitutional perspective, it doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be armies raised in this conflict like we saw in the Civil War. What we did see is an act of violence, which took place on January 6th. And I would say threats of violence leading up to that, with the express purpose of stopping or at least seriously postponing the certification of the electoral votes by the Congress and Vice President Pence in his role as president of the Senate. So it's clearly, in the broader scheme of things, an effort to subvert the constitutional process, the constitutional order. And it has been fascinating in just random reading the individuals who were inside the administration who recognize and acknowledge that it was an insurrection. There's an introduction to Bob Woodward and Robert Costa's book Peril, where Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley is having this conversation with Speaker Pelosi, and it is this horrific understanding by General Milley that this was an assault upon the very underpinnings of our constitutional government. There was an interview on the PBS NewsHour a couple of nights ago with Republican Congressman Meyer from Michigan, in which he acknowledges straight out that this was a violent attack to undermine the constitutional process. Mm-hmm. And I think that clearly fits within any definition of insurrection or rebellion. And so I think that being the second issue that the State Board of Elections will have to resolve is really clear on the evidence. We saw it. We've read about it. We have prominent individuals across the political spectrum who have acknowledged that this was an assault on our democracy.
So staying on that thread for just a minute, I wonder if you or your group or others who are involved in this have been thinking about how this could end up being potentially the tip of a spear on a number of challenges, because of course we know, and the evidence is bearing out, that a number of members of Congress in the House and the Senate were not only aware, but it appears many of them were aiding, at a minimum, communicating with those who were organizing these events. Some of them understood what was happening and took no action. So that's a next layer of things that, folks like Senator Mike Lee, who also in Woodward and Costa's book clearly knew what was going on, was studying it very carefully, and chose not to say anything. So there's levels there, gradients of involvement in this. Do you see this as something that is, again, forgive me if I'm ignorant of the terms here, but in some ways kind of laying out the potential for some level of precedent, if this is successful, and or even if it's not, but certain definitions that are important are made. So talk about that forward thinking, both in the near term and then in the medium term, because unfortunately, I'm in the camp that believes that we're going to see more of this, both in 22 and 24, of people challenging and trying to undermine the constitutional process. Talk to us a little bit about that. How does this look when you think forward and think applying to other members of Congress, and what does this challenge in this case mean for that?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question, Joel. And I really need to give huge props to a nonprofit organization based in Amherst, Massachusetts, Free Speech for People, which has been the driving force in this. And this organization, ever since January 6th, has started a movement around the country and a discussion among legal scholars about the utilization of Article 14, Section 3, to address a broad range of political individuals who arguably violated their oath and then participated and supported this insurrection or rebellion. So they really have done an enormous amount of legal research on this. They've done outreach around the country. And it was this organization and their leadership that reached out to me through a former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, Jim Exum, who's on their board, and asked if I would participate here as local counsel, as one of local counsel. We have added Attorney John Wallace, who's a prominent election law expert here in North Carolina, to our state legal team. And so, yes, I think this case is the first in the nation that we're aware of arising out of the January 6th insurrection. And it will set precedent, I think. I mean, it's not inconceivable to me that the issue could end up at the U.S. Supreme Court in interpreting the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But I think the Cawthorn case is the first, and we're laying the groundwork potentially for other challenges across the country. It is important to note, though, that Our challenge is prospective in that it deals with his qualifications to run for office in 2022. It is not an effort to have the Congress remove him from his current position, because that's clearly within Congress's purview. Ours is limited to a prospective election challenge based upon the disqualifier in the 14th Amendment.
Got it. Yeah, good clarification, and also maybe a good spot for us to pivot and talk a little bit more about this race. This is important for a number of reasons. We've kicked off the conversation because we think that Madison Cawthorn needs to be unseated, or more accurately in this case, not win election again, since he's in a different district, and are participating in a number of ways to make that happen. But talk to us a little bit about the dynamics. Give us your a couple of minute version as the wise one on this race of just how this whole thing is unfolded, and feel free to start at the beginning and take us to kind of where we got, if you want to give us a short summary of this race. And
the challenge may be giving you a short summary, Joel.
Okay.
It really is mind-boggling, and I'll put my plug in now for my podcast, which is the Battle for NC 14. It started out the Battle for NC 11 because that was the numerical designation for the congressional district that Cawthorn was elected from. North Carolina got an extra congressional seat because of the census and redistricting. So they renumbered everything, really messed up my podcast. We had all the logos and all the promos saying the Battle for NC 11, and then all of a sudden it's the Battle for NC 14.
Yeah, well, I'll add to your plug for those who are listening. You definitely go check it out. I remember the first time I turned it on and listened to the intro, and I was immediately drawn in. Not only is Judge Orr a great storyteller and has a great voice to listen to, but just the crazy amount of interesting things that have gone on for us to get to this point, and it's only gotten more interesting, right, over the case of this whole thing. So walk us through where has this thing been and where are we at?
Well, you really have to go back to 2020 when, right before filing, the incumbent congressman, fellow you may have heard of named Mark Meadows, and whom everybody thought was going to run for re-election, suddenly announced right at the filing date that he was not. And of course, he was moving to be Trump's chief of staff. And so the primary to replace Meadows was really chaos. There were like 11 different candidates, a number of probably well-qualified, particularly Republican candidates, didn't get in because they'd already committed to other races. And among that 11 was this individual, this 24-year-old wheelchair-bound individual that nobody had ever heard of, or very few people had ever heard of. And the favorite in the race was a woman named Linda Bennett that Meadows' family was close to, and so Meadows and Trump endorsed this woman in the primary. And so, surprisingly, Cawthorn finished second in the initial primary, and it was like, who is this guy? I mean, his campaign ad showed him in these muscle shirts with more weapons than a army platoon. I mean, it was it was crazy, and he. But he finished second, so he was in a runoff, and everybody was really sour at Linda Bennett and the way Meadows had handled this. And Cawthorn had a former sheriff in one of the key counties, George Irwin, who really sort of worked law enforcement. And boom, all of a sudden, Madison Cawthorn is the nominee of the Republican Party. It was a good year for Trump and Trump candidates for the most part in North Carolina. And so Cawthorn is elected, and literally when he was elected, he was not old enough under the Constitution, another disqualifier, but before he took the oath of office, he turned 25. So he immediately becomes this media celebrity. And I'll say, if he's a handsome, buff guy with kind of a sad personal story because of this tragic accident that left him partially paralyzed and wheelchair bound. And so, but the interesting thing is, it's not like he was there to do the work of a congressman. He said right from the beginning, I'm hiring nothing but comm people, communications people. I'm not going to worry about experts on veterans affairs or legislation. It was all about, how can I promote Madison Cawthorn and sort of the Trump cause.
Which I want to pause you there, Judge Orr, because it's an interesting. The backstory is so fascinating on this race because it was Meadows' seat, and Meadows then, of course, was the chief of staff for Trump. Not only was it was kind of a Trump loss essentially, because their favored candidate didn't win,
right.
But then Cawthorn wins and is arguably more Trumpy than the other candidate would have been, and has fully embraced the full Trump movement. And so there's this element that's very closely tied to Trump and Trumpism through Meadows, through Cawthorn's choices, that adds a layer of where we're at now that I think is critical to remember as well, that this race has now become not just simply about someone who is on their own, building a brand and being bombastic for its own sake and really failing to legislate. That in and of itself would be a problem, and it is a problem in other districts. But this is also layered in with, I think, an important fight around the future of conservatism, republicanism, certainly Trumpism, all tied into this race very, very closely.
Yeah, and it really sort of plays into the most recent development in the race. But so Cawthorn immediately starts drawing challengers. Remember, he's only been in office literally a year. And you have, at the time, 3 Republicans with, over the course of the spring and summer, announced that they're going to run against him in the congressional race. A retired Colonel Rod Honeycutt, a young woman with a master's in public administration who served 9 years in the Navy, Wendy Navarez, and then others have also gotten in. And then there were like 6 Democrats who jumped in, and it was really and I've interviewed all of the Democrats and some of the Republicans. I mean, they really are a quality group of individuals, all genuinely committed and concerned about the course of the country. But the favorite in the race is a young woman named Jasmine Beach Ferrara, who is a minister and equality activist. She's a gay woman married with children. She's served in her second term on the Buncombe County Commissioners, and she is sort of the favorite in the race. Although, candidly, the question, she even raises it in her introductory video. Can a gay woman, Democrat, in the congressional district win? But she's the favorite. And so when I started the podcast, it was like, okay, this could turn out to be a major culture war clash if it's Beach Ferraro versus Cawthorn. And that's not to say there are other really good candidates, Katie Dean and Eric Gash, who's a African-American former football player at UNC for Mac Brown. I mean, it's a fascinating group of individuals. But it just seemed to be teed up, particularly with Cawthorn. He's a prodigious fundraiser. I think he raised $2 million in the last quarter. And so I thought the podcast would be an interesting opportunity for all the candidates to sort of get their message out to a broader audience than you'd normally get. And then after the redistricting process here in North Carolina was finished, and they made some tweaks to what was then the 11th, they changed the number to the 14th, as I indicated. And a few weeks later, and let me back up. The 13th was ostensibly drawn for the North Carolina Speaker of the House, Republican Tim Moore. That's his home area, Cleveland County. And so everybody assumed that the 13th was being drawn for Tim Moore. Well, out of the blue, Cawthorn suddenly announces, well, I'm not going to run in the district that I was elected in. I'm going to run in the 13th. arguably because it was even far more favorable to a Republican.
So let me
And
pause you right there for a minute
yeah,
and
sure.
give our viewers who may not totally understand the ins and outs of redistricting a brief primer on that. So what's happening there, and you can correct me if you think I'm missing this, but just so folks understand, those who end up drawing the lines, every state is different. Some states have independent commissions, some it's the job of the legislature, some there's a combination. Those who end up drawing the lines, despite all claims otherwise, the process is very partisan, even when it's not. And so there's often conversations in back rooms about, hey, let's see if we can make a district that's favorable for so and so.
Right.
And that's what's happening. So tied up in all this story is, of course, another story, which is the continued problems with gerrymandering and cherry picking districts. But be that as it may, that's what happened there, as Judge Orr was laying out. So continue with the story there.
Well, so Cawthorn, announces he's going to move, I guess, to this new district, which is east of the 14th. And I should say the current 11th, new 14th is essentially Western North Carolina. We're hemmed in by Tennessee, Virginia, South Carolina, and it's the mountains in the western part of the state. The 13th is southeast of that. It stretches from a portion of Mecklenburg County, which is Charlotte, up into some very strong Republican counties in sort of the foothills of the state. Cawthorn announces, and then Speaker Tim Moore, within a couple of days, says, well, I'm just going to continue and run for my seat here in the state legislature, and I will not be running for Congress. And I think everybody was like, whoa, what? In Cawthorn, and this goes to the point you made, Joel, earlier about this war within the Republican Party. Cawthorn, in this veiled reference to Speaker Moore, just sort of blast these rhino, weak, wishy-washy Republicans, and that the 13th needed a real conservative, and I think there were a lot of folks offended by the way he approached it. One of whom was Senator Tillis's wife. The Tillises are residents in the 13th. And she very pointedly said, I think it was on Twitter, we don't need Mr. Cawthorn's advice on, who the best candidates are. So to add the final twist to his move to the 13th, back in the original race in the 14th, there was a Democrat candidate named Josh Remillard who had served two tours of duty in Iraq, was a really interesting, fascinating guy. And his video, if people haven't seen his video, they really need to go to Josh Remillard for Congress and look at it.
That's fantastic.
He goes after Cawthorn. I mean, he literally says he's a traitor, and my job is to keep him from being elected to Congress. So Remillard says, oh, okay, you're moving to the 13th. I'm going to the 13th too. And so now, he's probably the leading Democrat. I don't even know if there's another Democrat that's announced in the 13th. So lots and lots of really sort of interesting dynamics.
Yeah. So I want to dive into one of those dynamics, which I think is pertinent both to this race and to your constitutional challenge and to the broader environment right now, which is what you mentioned among kind of the establishment, so to speak, Republicans. That word is usually used in a derogatory nature by some people. Cawthorn certainly played out of the Trump playbook in calling them rhinos, Republicans in name only, and really pitting this what we refer to often at Renew America as the Republican Civil War, in the sense that you've got two very distinct factions. One which is born out of what I would point to the Tea Party as kind of the early stages of what then became the Freedom Caucus in the House, and then was really a precursor to what has now just been wholly bought, paid for, owned by the Trump organization and Trumpism. They've all really just kind of moved into that space for the most part. So that's one faction, and then the other major faction being, these long time kind of more traditional, we'll call them, Chamber of Commerce conservatives, so to speak, less interested in culture wars, more interested in moving the economy forward and broader kind of institutional guardrails, et cetera. And you have these two very strong factions. And that's at play, not just in this race, but really across the country. We're seeing in a number of state legislatures, for example, and talking to friends, there are groups that are really going to war with one another. Some of these factions that are led by Turning Point USA and that whole group. In Georgia with Marjorie Taylor Greene, they're trying to recruit candidates to run against good Republicans in state legislative districts. We're seeing it in places like Idaho, obscure places where, there's these wars that are very much under the radar, but very much happening. Arizona, much more prominently, this fight is happening. So there's this narrative and this broad fight that's happening across the country. And this race is emblematic of that. And I think what we're going to see, and would be interested in your thoughts on this, is that you're going to see this, we'll call it kind of the Tillis and longtime Republican faction, now having to take on and make some hard decisions about what they're going to do. Now, there could be another Republican emerge that could try to take him out in the primary. As you mentioned, you've got Josh Remillard potentially in the general. And then you've got the element of this legal challenge. So as you think about that element, Judge Orr, and kind of that Republican Civil War, if you will, how do you see that playing into this race? And also, if you want to comment on how the constitutional challenge fits into that narrative or that space.
Well, I think Cawthorn has explicitly said this is the party of Trump. I mean, he hasn't inferred it. He's said it. This is the party of Trump. And if you're not in the party of Trump, you're not with us. And so I think there are a lot of, we used to call them mountain Republicans. That's historically where the Republican Party was based, going all the way back to the post-Civil War. And the country club Republicans, the business folks in Charlotte, et cetera.
Right.
They are not necessarily buying into the party of Trump, but as we've seen across the country, with a few exceptions, the Republican leadership has been unwilling to take on the party of Trump as a cancer to the party. And even though we're here to talk about the Cawthorn race, I have to mention the U.S. Senate race to replace Senator Burr. Mm-hmm. And Pat McCrory, the former governor, former mayor of Charlotte, one would describe him as a moderate conservative, is being, just ripped apart by millions of dollars being poured in by the Club for Growth and pro-Trump forces in favor of their candidate, Ted Budd, who was a congressman. And so if there's any race that epitomizes this division, mm-hmm. It's going to be the McCrory-Budd race, and Trump endorsed Budd. So there's a lot to watch out for there. Interestingly, on our constitutional challenge to Cawthorn's qualifications to run, I think there are a lot of Republicans secretly cheering us on. They can't come out and say, "Well, I hope you're successful," but I've seen very little media support for Cawthorn or defense of Cawthorn, at least within the state. There have been some national Trump type publications that have questioned the challenge, but it does set an important precedent on the issue of Article 14, Section 3. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things about the North Carolina challenge statute is once you've met that initial threshold of a suspicion of disqualification, the burden shifts to the candidate to prove that he or she is qualified. And there's a right for us to take Cawthorn's deposition, to have subpoenas issued. And so this has substantial potential to gather even more information, although we think on the public record, there's more than enough to have him disqualified.
Fascinating. It's really an interesting case, and really grateful that you and others are involved in taking this path, because at a minimum, even those who may be skeptical of this, I think if you're listening, and that may be you, I think we could probably agree that we need to explore this question as to what really took place on that day, who was involved, were people who are elected to the United States Congress involved in an active attempt to undermine our democracy. And that is a fundamental question. I think, many on the left just take it as a foregone conclusion. And that's fine for them to do that. As somebody who is a conservative personally, though I'm an independent, I think it's important that we really take seriously this question, because this is not just a political football. This is really about the foundations of our democracy. And what do we mean when we say peaceful transfer of power? What do we mean when we say insurrection? God forbid we call it a coup. I mean, there's all kinds of rhetoric that happens out there. I think we need to establish some good guardrails, both for the public discourse and, of course, legally speaking, so that there are understandings from those who are elected of, if you participate in this kind of activity, this is what's going to happen. So I think it's just such an important case, Judge Orr, and really appreciate you being a part of it. As we get ready to close up here in a minute or two, would love for you to make any comment that you might have on this broader question of really the guardrails of our democracy, and the importance of, I'll call it just the cross-partisan coalition of people that are coming together. You can talk about your background if you'd like. What we're seeing is that people from the center left, the center right, true kind of centrists, all across that spectrum, as well as some folks from the progressive left, even, who really are valuing this work of protecting democracy from a cross-partisan coalition. Give us some reflections on that. You've been involved in that fight with a bunch of different organizations. You clearly see it as important. Would love to hear just some parting thoughts on why this kind of stuff is important, and about the guardrails of our democracy.
Well, you may not have enough time left on the program to talk about all of this, but it is critically important. And just by way of background, I have carried the water for the Republican Party literally for 45 years of my adult life. I've been everything from a precinct chairman to a county chairman. I was the nominee of the Republican Party in 5 statewide judicial races, won the last 4 of them, 2 of them for the Supreme Court. Ran in the primary for governor in 2008, thinking that good ideas would trump no money. That was a bad decision. But it was. And I voted for every single Republican nominee for president, from Richard Nixon in 1968 up until the time that Donald Trump ran for president, and I could not vote for him. And what has transpired within the Republican Party, what I used to know as the Republican Party, has been so disillusioning, so disheartening, so concerning, that after January 6th, I changed my party affiliation to unaffiliated. And, so they may lambaste me. I am not a liberal activist. I think I've paid my dues for the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I don't think is getting any real attention is the importance of the oath of office. It's in the Constitution, and it says that when you take that oath, it is a promise to support, maintain, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And what we saw on January 6th and leading up to it is Trump and his minions having a total disregard for the importance and the really the sacred nature of that oath. It was like, we want to stay in power, and so therefore we're going to do whatever we need to do. We're going to squeeze Mike Pence until he squeals. We're going to get the big lie perpetrated across the country through our favored media outlets and convince people that it's okay for us to have a mob storm the Capitol. It's okay for us to have the certification process set out in the Constitution and the laws of the United States subverted, because it would allow them to maintain power. And never in my lifetime, I'm an old guy, never in my lifetime could I have imagined not only the physical violence that took place on January 6th, but a president of the United States and his immediate, supporters trying to undermine the very basic principles that the country is founded on, the peaceful transfer of power. And so while I had pretty well decided I was going to leave the Republican Party, not so much because of Trump, but because of the unwillingness of people who knew better, who had leadership responsibilities, failing to do that. And I so admire Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and that handful of others who've been willing to not go along. And I don't know the South Dakota senator's name that is catching all the flack because he made the outrageous statement of, Joe Biden won that election fair and square, and now he's being attacked by Trump and everybody. So the battle both within the Republican Party, but the greater battle for literally the soul of America, the longer term principles of democracy that we have tried to aspire to, are threatened. And if people aren't willing to stand up like you, Joel, and Miles and Evan, and all the folks who are saying, no, we cannot let this happen. I mean, I think we would literally be in a authoritarian state of governance within the next couple of years. And I find that so disheartening in so many ways, but I think we have an obligation, to participate in the fight. And that's why I was happy to join the Free Speech for People organization's efforts to challenge Cawthorn's qualifications, because that oath and that violation of the oath is really, really a critical disqualifier for somebody to hold significant public office.
Well, Judge Orr, thank you so much for standing up, for participating, for doing your part to help to preserve our democracy, and thank you for the kind words. For those who are listening, please do follow up on this news with this group, as well as keep a close eye on the Cawthorn race generally. But more broadly, we're so thankful that you took time to listen. Continue to follow us at Renew America Movement. This will be posted on all of our social channels, on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. Please take a look, share it with your friends. Let's have a discussion about this important conversation. But we really appreciate your support. Judge Orr, we so appreciate you giving us this time this morning, and look forward to what's going to come ahead.
Thank you so much, Joel, and best of luck. Go get him.